If you've been building Gundams for a long time, you've probably come across some kits that are made out of resin. And you've wondered to yourself, what are resin kits? They come in a variety of different shapes and forms. It could be superheroes, it could be anime figures, manga figures, whatever the case is. A resin kit is definitely different from a Gundam kit, and here's why. Pretty much all of these resin kits start out as a sculpture, such as this Majin Buu figure that I've been working on for the past probably 4 years now, and I'll probably never finish it, honestly. This has been sculpted out of monster clay. And from here, what I would do if I want to make a mold of it is get some silicone, make a box, put this in that box, and in the most simplest of terms, fill it up with the silicone. Once that hardened, I cut the silicone mold in half and pop out the actual original sculpt, put it back together, put it in a box, and pour in my resin. And from there is where I will have my completed resin kit, such as this super deformed resin Guyver kit. A lot of times you'll have companies that produce knockoff kits of the original molds, and you'll end up finding a lot more casting marks and imperfections on the piece itself. What's so different about these versus a typical Gundam kit that we're all pretty much used to is the fact that these are designed on a computer. And the parts come in runners right here, because the actual mold for these is made out of a giant steel block, and then a CNC machine goes and cuts all these pieces out into the actual steel block itself. Once that happens, they put the two pieces together and they injection mold polystyrene, and you get this. One thing of note is the fact that it seems a lot easier to build than something like this that looks like this. And you might be right. However, there's other steps that have to be taken into consideration. Whereas with a Gundam kit, you're able to have the freedom of painting each piece individually like this and not having to worry about tape masking a ton of different parts depending on the paint finish you're going for. When it comes to building a resin kit, as you can see right here, they're one solid piece that would normally be made up of multiple pieces on a Gundam kit. So let's say this head right here on this Barbatos, you'll see that it's a bunch of different parts. You would not have to go and mask all of these individual pieces off bit by bit as you're layering with your airbrushing, because they come off individually and you can paint it individually. You do not have that freedom with resin kits. Resin kits are pre-sculpted, as mentioned before, and as a result, yes, it's easy to assemble, but you have a lot of masking that you have to do when it comes time to painting and airbrushing. If you'll notice here on the head, how I would typically do this is airbrush all the areas first with my base color, get that nice and finished, and then I would have to mask, take tape, and mask all of these areas off in here, little by little, so this way all that's exposed is this area, and then I would go in and airbrush all of this. Yes, that takes a lot more time in the painting department than doing the typical Gundam build. There are ways around masking everything and going crazy with yourself with trying to get all these tiny details masked, and that's with using a certain type of brush paint. Brush paints themselves, like enamel paints and lacquer paints that you're pretty much used to seeing at Michael's or Hobby Lobby or other hobby stores, they leave kind of a caked on effect, a caked on look, and they don't look smooth. They kind of don't look that great. There are paints specifically formulated to be able to use for brushing, which removes a lot of the brush marks, and you're allowed to actually blend them to almost an airbrushed effect. One of them that I will mention are called Citadel. Citadel paints, if you've ever seen those little Warhammer 40K figurines, the little pewter figures, whether it's Dungeons and Dragons or whatever it is, you'll notice that they're painted really ornately in areas that would otherwise be almost impossible to airbrush because they're so small. That's where those brush paints will come in. Depending on your technique, the paint is already pre-mixed, it's very smooth, flows nicely, and I highly recommend using them. As a matter of fact, I have a couple of here, so I'll place one right here, and this is it. The nice part about it is these, like I said, are pre-mixed already, so the viscosity is such where it's pretty smooth when it goes on, and it allows for a lot of good blending effects. Another thing of note is sometimes resin kits will come with little LEDs and little wiring kits and stuff like that, whereas, Gundam kits will do that as well, but normally with optional expansion sets. The only catch with these is at times you'll end up having to carve away some areas. You'll have to be ingenuitive when it comes to wiring things, basically the same way it would be really if you're doing a custom LED job on a Gundam. This kit came with a very rudimentary little LED pack right here that really does not fit. This actually is a recast of a Neo grade kit which is no longer in production. That kit came with a full LED expansion set to it, and it worked beautifully. Other things of note with resin kits when prepping them for paint, you actually have to do a little body work. If you'll notice, some of these parts here have these little areas that need to be sanded down in order for the parts to fit appropriately. These you just take different grits of sandpaper and just chunk them down. A Dremel with a little barrel sander bit to it will make quick work of this, but you got to be careful you don't overdo it, obviously. But once all these pieces are sanded down, you're going to have a kit that fits really nicely together, and ultimately you can assemble the whole thing using nothing more than regular super glue. Super glue pretty much works best for these. You can use 2-part epoxies as well, but I like to use super glue. It holds pretty well. Just make sure that you sand everything a little bit inside there and between the parts you're going to join, so this way they get a nice chemical bond with the actual resin itself, because these parts are pretty smooth. Another thing to have in your toolbox when it comes to building resin kits, after you've prepped everything so fitment is proper, you can actually go out and buy some blue tack that you can put on walls for pictures without having to put nails through it. That sticks pretty well and will hold these parts together pretty good for you to get an idea as to what it's going to look like finished, and to see if there's any other areas that you may need to fill with a certain type of filler or anything like that. One last thing too is the fact that these kits have to be primed. And when you're going to prep them for paint, you want to wash them in a mild dish soap. That'll degrease everything very well, and at that point you dry it off thoroughly, and then it's ready for priming. Priming, you could use whatever you want. If it's lacquer you're doing, enamel, acrylic, whatever it is, prime these first, because the paint can have a tendency to flake off of these really easy if they're not primed appropriately ahead of time. Resin kits have their advantages. They do have their pros in the fact that they're very easy to build. You can get it built in nothing flat. But the challenge comes when it's time to actually paint them. So my recommendation is to learn how to be able to use brush paints as well in conjunction with the airbrushing. Once you get the two of those together, it could save you a lot of time when it comes to masking stuff off. And if you learn how to brush paint well enough, especially using the right kind of paints, you really won't be able to tell as far as the finished kit if it's all been airbrushed or not. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures right now of some of the Guyver kits that I've done in the past, that I've used the combination of both airbrushing and brush painting together to give the finished effect. Those are coming up right now. In conclusion, I would highly suggest you find a resin kit that looks relatively easy to do and start practicing on them, because it opens up a big door when it comes to customizing Gundam kits as well, because some of these Gundam kits also have resin expansion sets to them, as I mentioned before in the last video. And in those resin expansion sets, you're going to be using the same principles as you would for this on this. However, you're going to be mixing parts of polystyrene plus the resin parts as well. It's also going to open up the doorway for you to be a lot more creative in your finished builds at the end of the day, which I'm sure plenty of you want to be able to do. With that said, thank you very much for watching this video. If you liked what you saw, please like, subscribe, share, and comment below. Let me know what you thought, and if there's anything more you want to see in future videos, I will gladly facilitate that to the best of my abilities. And I thank you very much for watching. Bye!